Government fails, the world's off its rails, leaders are whacked, democracy is under attack. It's time to get smart, folks, time to get real. Let's cut through the crap, tell us how you feel. Let's cue the talent, let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, we've got a deep subject today, but I mean, it's really important and it has a lot to do with the part of the country that I'm in. You know, this is called Straight Talk, Straight from the Heartland. I'm here in the Farm Belt, folks, and it's a real head scratcher. I find myself wondering all the time, what in the hell is going on with Republican politics and what is this Donald Trump thing? Because everybody's telling me that the Republicans are going to steamroll again in 2022 and that Trump may be coming back in 2024. I can't hardly believe it, but then I just saw something that kind of lays it all out and makes me not only believe it, but makes me understand it. And it was on Paul J., the great Paul J. It was on his website. He did a series of interviews with Dr. Thomas Ferguson. And I'm going to bring his little live line thing up here. I want to Dr. Thomas Ferguson on the Podcast by George live line. Dr. Ferguson is Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's Director of Research at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and a Senior Fellow at Better Markets. And here's the paper. This is the title of it. And I'm going to, a subtitle, I'm going to run a chyron, a lower third here, where you can go and find this, read this. And this is, this is really jaw-dropping stuff. And I'm happy to have him on the show. The title, The Knife Edge Election of 2020, American Politics from Washington, Kabul, and Weimar. Thomas Ferguson, Paul Jorgensen, and Ji Chen. Working paper number 169, November 7th, 2021. I kind of like that. It's got that little watermark on it that tells people at the time that it was not peer-reviewed. And I mean, it's all great stuff. And here's a chart that I'm going to start with here. Now, this is off Paul J's website. Go to Paul J. Go to theanalysis.news and check out the entire series of interviews with Dr. Ferguson. But also, there's a series of interviews with Podcast by George. He just put up a new one today that Paul J. and I did, and I'm thrilled about that. So make sure that you go to his website. But this shows you kind of what's going on here in the heartland with Donald Trump and Republican politics and what we're going to be talking about today with Dr. Ferguson. I mean, look at that graph. So we can come back to that later. So let's bring that down off the screen and bring him in and welcome Dr. Thomas Ferguson to the Podcast by George live line.
Hi there. I'm glad to be here, even in the middle of winter on an absolutely desolate day, I have to say.
Yeah, that winter storm is moving through a lot of snow down in, further south up where he's at. There's a lot of ice. We're just kind of in the deep freeze here in Iowa. I mean, these are the dog days of winter. Well, I wanted to start off, Doctor, by reading a little bit of the and use these kind of as bouncing off points, sections of the paper. We're going to be talking about agriculture, but I wanted to start with this. It's almost like digressing at the beginning, but I just couldn't get away from it because of how well written it is, and it's kind of like a summation almost before we get going, but I want to read this. And it says, all this persuades us that a careful look at what happened in the 2020 election is not idle curiosity. Elections, especially in money-driven political systems, and that's key because that's what this paper is a lot about. They're complicated affairs that repay analysis at many different levels. The political money played a vital role in the Democratic primaries. It was obvious even at the time. Man, I remember this well here in Iowa. I mean, we're the first caucus. We're the first test. For example, regardless of their merits, late entering candidates like Michael Bloomberg would have been ignored by the press and political leaders were they not billionaires. Nor could anyone expect someone from the 1% ever have garnered more than 12% of the votes, folks, in states culturally light years from New York City, like Tennessee, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Alabama, Utah, Texas, or Colorado, after just a few weeks of campaigning. Roughly the same holds true for Tom Steyer. God, nobody talks about that guy anymore. 12% of the vote down in South Carolina, the primary there, that would likely have been zero without all of his money. And of course, that's where Barack Obama got involved in it, and Jim Clyburn and those guys. Even more obvious and more significant was the golden horde of contributions that the Democratic establishment mobilized to turn back Sanders and with some qualifications, Warren. But they say in the paper, for reasons of space, we cannot try to unravel the primaries in the paper, nor, because everything else would have to get short shrift, can we analyze the behavior of investor blocks in the election in any detail. Well, okay, so we're going to get and talk about politics. I got to ask you right off the top, though, Doc. Iowa, those Iowa caucuses, and that we talk about this all the time with Dr. Stephen W. Schmidt from Iowa State University. I mean, they imploded because of the accounting that they couldn't even complete. We didn't even get a winner, according to the Associated Press here in Iowa. Some of the real lefties on the progressive side blame that on some subterfuge by the DNC and that shadow app and the phone that they had. From where you sit and you look at Iowa and the caucuses, how do you look at it? I'm interested because you're not here with us. You're kind of on the outside looking in.
Yeah, but that actually, George, makes me a little reluctant to state a strong opinion. Iowa was very peculiar. I mean, and I was sitting there watching the votes come in and thinking, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And why are so many papers rushing to credit Buttigieg?
Yes.
Who's a friend, I mean, and very close, has been for many years to what we will call the Facebook crowd. I mean, they all went to college together, and there's famous picture of Buttigieg and I think Zuckerberg's car, or vice versa. One is it. Anyway, bottom line on this is I can't tell you for sure, but it sure was peculiar. And more generally, I'm quite happy, feel very confident in saying, yeah, the DNC didn't like Bernie Sanders. They didn't like him in 2016. We all found that out when the emails leaked there. And nobody's leaked emails in 2020, but yeah, you can be sure they didn't like Bernie Sanders. So all I can say is, it's not that difficult to do this stuff right. And when you see repeated failures and weird stuff, you got to ask what is going on. But for somebody like me to claim they understand what happened, I don't understand what happened, except that it shouldn't have happened. A good question to ask is what happened to all the folks responsible, whether they're sitting in a sort of ignominious or are they sitting in relatively happy places, perhaps with benefits bestowed on them by the Biden administration. I have seen no follow-up on this.
That's kind of the American way anymore, no accountability. Well, let's get back to this paper because I want to talk agriculture. I want to talk what's in here. So this reads, okay, now before I start to read this slide, maybe start here. Why this is so important is because nobody covered agriculture's role hardly, and it was huge.
It's crazy. Look, more generally, let's start with a broader point, which is when you get election analysis in American media, or to a very large extent in political science or economics, it's very superficial. Typically, all you get is a pick of a few questions out of polls. And the striking thing to me is, I've been dealing with polls for years. I once was the assistant to the guy who actually took the New York Times poll. I wasn't doing that poll with him. He was teaching at Princeton, and I was his teaching assistant, Mike Keggy. At that time, we were trying to sort of maintain standards. Keggy made the point to me one day, just saying, look, of course you print income figures, income breakdowns in polls. If you notice, very few polls now report income. They give you education, which you're supposed to, I guess, think of as a proxy. It's just close enough to be very misleading sometimes on that point. And I am very struck by the way the sort of the canned character of the polls, the highly stereotyped character of the analysis is very obvious to me. And, on election night, it'd be the simplest thing on earth to say, let's put an income control in. Now let's look at the breakdown, race, gender, et cetera. They don't do that. They give you these raw breakdowns. with single variable breakdowns against the vote. And in effect, all the effects of everything that's going in there get pretty much cut through that one variable. It's hugely misleading. And that said, then you have the problem. If you don't like that, what do you do? And the 2020 election is pretty tricky because they don't make those polls really available to folks to look at. You can find more detailed breakdowns sometimes in CNN, which had, or some others. But even the New York Times does not do what it used to do on these things, in my opinion. So we are often led around by the nose by a combination of highly stereotyped poll selective cherry picking, and then a bunch of talking heads that are very happy to sit there and bob for the cherries. And it's sort of and it's like, it blew me away. I mean, when was the last time you heard a discussion of agriculture on any post-election TV program? I mean, if you heard one, send me the clipping sometime. Yeah. And I used to find it very mysterious too. I mean, this is all right. This is coming out of the farm heartland. I'm gonna just say it. I was struck by folks, what's the matter with Kansas and other books? When you actually analyze what they got to say about the economy in those areas, they have almost nothing in there about that. I never had trouble why the Democrats were very unpopular. I knew a lot of the farmers who were in the American agricultural movements at that point, who actually drove tractors up onto the Capitol in the near the Washington Monument there in the 80s, in protests. And there wasn't any discussion of Jimmy Carter and his grain policies, embargoes and things, or later efforts to. There was for a while 10 or 15 years of dissident farm groups of various sorts that were quite live, and there may be more out there that about that I don't see or hear. But there was basically almost nothing intelligent said about, what is, in spatial terms, a very large chunk of the United States. And in a federal system that overrepresents smaller population states, it's a lot of, say, the Senate, and it's less of the House. But anyway, the point is, you're not getting very sensible analysis there at all. And so my colleagues and I, Paul Jorgensen and Ji-Chen and I thought, well, let's do a spatial approach, because the American National Election Survey data, the standard political science stuff, wasn't available at all when we started working on this. And it was pretty clear to me that it had maybe some sample weight problems, which meant, in other words, buyer beware or user beware. So we took a spatial where we looked by county now at the vote, and then looked at what's driving, trying to tell what's driving what in that county. Now, that means you can't ask certain questions, because there's no way you can go from any form of demographic and economic data to exactly who's thinking what about, say, racial or ethnic issues or gender issues. There's just no way you can do it. And so, we warn readers that type of question, we don't contest the charge that race and gender were big factors in Trump's. I think that was true in 2016, where Ben Page and I and some other folks did a detailed paper on those individual elections with individual data. Although we also looked at spatial stuff, because we put them into congressional districts, was the only way you could do it. Anyway, bottom line on this stuff is you get mostly junk analysis in the media, usually highly stereotyped questions of a few that just go on endlessly, as though those were the only important stuff, and they're not. And so, that's what we were trying to do, is open this question up. And I think we hit the jackpot at many points, but one of them was the farm. I got to say that the Department of Agriculture was less than forthcoming. I mean, we called folks trying to get the data, found that the data had been spiked, as they say, quite deliberately, so you couldn't identify individual firms, things like that. So in the end, we had to sort of roll our own, as it were, go to private data collections and get, I mean, not as by other researchers, and then do a crop analysis, which is, I think, the proper way to do most of this stuff. And then we found out, then it became obvious that you were looking at one of the great subsidy waves of all time in American politics. Just incredible.
Yes.
And it's still amazing to me that you can't find a discussion of this anywhere else. I haven't seen it.
Well, that's great.
Except a few a few farm journals, we quote one there extensively, where the guy just lays it out. It's like, right to a bunch of farmers. I mean, I could tell from reading the farm journals, because I often read the trade journals, that people knew a lot. The Apple guys were, for example, just going bonkers because they were left out of the program.
I remember that. Yeah,
they were really bitter about it. I mean, this, maybe we should back up and just say, look, this started out as it was said at the time, to compensate for losses on Trump's China policy. And there are some studies that I accept that suggest that those cost the Republicans maybe 4 seats in the 2018 election. That's not a lot of seats. And, I suspect that the administration had figured that out, knew very well, okay, we just have to try a little harder, we won't have a problem. And they tried super hard. And so they started on these compensatory what they call it, I forget, market facilitation or something like that, payments. But then in the middle of this, in early 2020, COVID hits, and the commercial restaurant market pretty well dries up for farm produce, because nobody's, I mean, you go to if you go there, even on Valentine's Day, you go in a group of 3, and the third one is the Grim Reaper. So, that sort of put the chill in on restaurants, as everybody knows.
Yeah, it's huge business. Yeah, huge to the agriculture community. Sure it is. Yeah.
So then they started doing all kinds of compensatory stuff for that. And we found a way to go at it which was not easy to go at it by looking at the effect on the net effect of the crops on the voting in the regions. And then it was immediately obvious that you could see how the China stuff shaded into a much bigger program. And it was quite powerful and effective in those areas, I mean, that's basically the story. And it's like, if you're trying to find out how did Trump get 74 million votes? You can start with that answer.
Well, look at part of it. Look at that chart that I put up earlier. That has a lot to do with it. I want to, again, I have a tendency to digress, but I think it's good and it fits into this conversation. And I don't get to ask very many people this question. But I want to put it in this context for you, Dr. Ferguson. I grew up on a poor farm back in the 60s and 70s. Well, there was a guy that you and I remember because we're old enough named George Wallace that was running for president. Now, here's the interesting thing about him. Everybody thinks of him as a racist and a segregationist and all that type of thing. And, there's reason to remember him that. But for poor farmers like me, now I was 18 years old. My dad said, good luck. I mean, your mom broke your dinner plate. We took your bed apart. I mean, that's it, man. I was out on my own. I had friends eating commodity cheese. I mean, we were poor, boy. Well, this George Wallace guy came along, and people were looking at him not for the segregationist part of it or the racist part of it. They were looking at him as a guy that would upset the apple cart. And we didn't have any apples. I mean, you're talking about these apple growers. I mean, we just wanted some. And if we couldn't get some, we just wanted to deny other people because we didn't have any apples, so to speak. That was kind of the allure of the George Wallace candidacy where I was at. And I didn't support the guy. I didn't vote for him. I don't want anybody to think that. But that's not very often talked about. And when I look at Donald Trump and his candidacy, and I look at these people crawling through the windows of the Capitol and look at his attraction in these poor rural areas that we started off talking about, I think that's the apple cart. I mean, do you look at it that way at all?
Policy failure, summarized in a single sentence, I think policy failure persisting over really more than a generation, where, if you like, the net effect of trade and industrial policies pursued by the United States has been to drive a good chunk of the population into pretty desperate circumstances. I mean, the sort of highfalutin term for this is a dual economy, but it's basically where you effectively now have a situation where half or more of the population is sitting there with no pensions, uncertain wages, jobs, gig positions, or just low paid work. There's no way into the middle class. It's a huge look. That's the root of the problem, in my opinion. And my colleagues and I couldn't be blunter about it. Yes, I quite agree with that. And it doesn't help when you get you have two-party competition, so it is said. The Republicans are perfectly clear about what they think. That's what, but the Democrats, when Nancy Pelosi says it's okay to be in the stock market as you're writing laws and that it's okay to speculate,
yes.
All you can say is that's just an unacceptable position.
Yes.
You can't live with corruption on this scale. And
yes.
Money in politics has now gone crazy.
Absolutely.
That's a huge. It's really it's a true disaster.
Well, let's bring it home here to Iowa, because you talk about the history of agriculture and industry in the paper. At one time, Iowa was a Democratic state. I mean, back in the day, as I mentioned when I was talking about, it voted largely Democratic, but because of these subsidies and the underwriting from the government, farmers got wealthy. The corporations moved in, they bought up all the farmland. They're hugely powerful and successful businesses. By and large now, that's what farming is. And then in the cities, in states like Iowa, I think Des Moines is the second largest insurance capital in the country, next to the Hartford in Connecticut. You've got these huge insurance capitals in Iowa, Cedar Rapids and Des Moines particularly, large population centers. They've joined hands and they've got a death grip, a deadlock on Iowa and the Republican Party.
Yeah, let's take this in two steps if we could, because there are both points in your discussion. One is that I want to come back to that, in effect, the financialization of commodities.
Yeah.
Which is, but let's first the story. If you look at theories of political change in the United States, if you read, say, the New York Times or something, just pick on the Times because it's always trying to tell you what to think. You'll find these folks saying, well, it's really education or something that predicts partisan voting. Come on, guys. The Democrats did not decline in the Midwest because of any educational issues. What happened is very straightforward. As you alluded to, in the agricultural sector, in the farming areas, big farming drove out small farming. You can see that very, very straightforward in the numbers we cite from the Department of Agriculture. That there are still a lot of small farms, but they're really tiny in terms of their output, and that farm output is hugely concentrated in fairly large, rich, and formally family-run corporations. But we're not talking about mom and dad getting up in the morning to milk the cows or something.
That's right.
In effect, they're multi-plant agricultural factories, if you like, there. And with a substantial amount of imported labor to run it too. All right. Mm-hmm. Now so you get this process of you drive out poor farmers, pretty much. And then you have this simultaneous contraction of manufacturing. Look, agricultural implements and things like that were made all over the Midwest, and they were big factory jobs. There was a very substantial car or agricultural implement industries all through there. Those mostly were blown away by globalization. And to some extent by technological change. Again, I think the relative emphasis on this has often misplaced. My reading of this is, there was a fair amount of technical change, automation, but basically they moved the stuff overseas and imported it right back. There. Okay. So so you blow away the urban Democratic vote in the space of about 20 years max. And then you shrink the small farmer bases for a Democratic vote. Nobody's ever disputed that most big farmers they saved for a few years, maybe in the High New Deal, were Republican oriented. I mean, the Farm Bureau Federation, everybody knows, has been mostly Republican for as long as I have been born or you have been born. There, and neither of us are as old as the pyramids. I flatly denied to my students when I was teaching that I had seen the sun hit the Great Pyramid. I said this is a vicious rumor, But anyway, and no, all right, I'll stop there. Anyway, the point is, this isn't an educational process. It's a jobs transformation and political economy process. It has big impacts on people's ideas, hopes, and thinking. And if you just poll about those, you're going to think it's about people's, hopes and thinking. But fundamentally, it's a political economy story. And every time anybody tells you that this is education, just laugh in their face. It's just people should just choke on this stuff. All right, that's number one. And now let's further about the transformation inside agriculture. Now, I'm not sure I have a complete grasp of this, but I have done my best to understand it. And I will tell you this, that particularly in 2006, when the various, a couple of federal agencies are relevant here, but they removed the position limits on what you could hold in commodity futures markets. Financial companies just came in on an enormous basis. They bought a lot. I remember when AIG had to liquidate after they were taken over, when one of their little efforts miscarried and they went bust. They didn't formally go bust, they were rescued. But they had to liquidate all their agricultural commodities in a single day, and it crashed markets everywhere. I remember that, never forgotten it. The lesson was, boy, is there a lot of stuff being held there. And there have been endless arguments about position limit stuff. I mean, it is not helpful that the current head of the SEC under Biden seems to think that you should have position limits on individuals, but not in the market as a whole. I mean, that's crazy, because all you do is you got a flock of individuals coming in. If you can see a trend, then it's not a general proposition. But I think position limits tend, when you take them out, they tend to increase volatility a bit. But the big story is, if a trend clearly emerges, say for rising prices, say due to any number of climate related stuff, then people pile in like crazy and they drive the prices up faster than you need or want to. And it's big money in this stuff. So the financialization of commodities is a big story. The Biden administration missed, I think, a trick early on in both oil and futures. They should have thought about this instead of just, they spent months on the oil case. They were just talking about finally opening the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They finally did open it. My point on all of that stuff was, look, guys, if it's a one-way bet in commodity markets, everybody is going to make that one-way bet. So do something. Now they've you can't do endless opening of petroleum reserves unless you want to have no reserve. And so they should, this whole business needs a rethink. They haven't done it. They're not going to do it. You've got the main advisors for many of the folks who are important around Biden are folks coming from private equity firms. This is not a sensible situation at all. And yes, it means the extension into agriculture of all kinds of, finance, but also chemical companies, seed companies, you name it. Agribusiness, it's grown and enlarged, and it doesn't lead. I got political science colleagues that talk about this as, see, it's becoming pluralistic. No, it's a pluralism of large investors. That doesn't work out for ordinary people.
I was struck in the interview that you did with Paul Jay. I talked about that earlier, that it's your analysis that the finance community got their use out of Donald Trump, and they about got what they wanted out of him, and they were tired of Trump. But I'm not so sure that it's true of farmers because of that chart that I showed earlier. But he's still very popular here, and they don't seem to have wearied of Donald Trump yet.
Well, I'm looking. I mean, the problem for the Democrats is I haven't been able to ever figure out that they even had a a policy that was distinct from the Republicans.
Yes, that is.
It just so happens that the current agricultural secretary is a gentleman I suspect you know very well, at least by reputation.
Bill
And
Sankey.
what are the Democrats seem to just tag along with the Republicans pretty much, usually on a smaller scale. Which of course loses them votes in the farm areas. And they don't seem to have, I mean, I was not happy with the policies on worker safety in the farm areas, particularly in meat packing, because meat packing is something that used to be done in Milwaukee and Chicago, and now is done much nearer where the flocks are.
The herds, yeah.
And you had, we know it's been well attested, and the references in our paper, that you had people doing, you had executives in meatpacking firms putting bets on who was going to drop next. That the default on worker safety, it's not just in farm areas, and it's not, I do think that meatpacking was maybe the worst case of all,
Yeah.
but it's been complete and wholesale, and the Biden administration has been very slow on this stuff. They did not move vigorously with OSHA, even though they promised to do it.
And they had an opportunity to make some inroads there. There's an interesting thing about the meatpacking industry that I heard you say, and that is that you would think that they might be able to rise up, that they might be able to organize, that they might be able to make more noise than they are. But people need to understand that a lot of these workers kind of want to stay on the down low, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, they often are not. You're not going to find great U.S. statistics on numbers of immigrants with no papers in industries. Guess why? They just don't fill out census forms, in general. But yeah, you've got a policy where you've got lots of people who are not citizens, or they are historically discriminated against minorities, Hispanic, Black. And the local folks often are kind of in league against them at the level of the county authorities and the large agricultural interests. Yeah.
Well, and
it's a huge problem. And the Democrat, I don't know what the Democrats are doing about it. What strikes me, they seem to just ignore all of this. And they'd like you to sort. It's as though they treat the United States as one big city. It isn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way that I would describe it, maybe it's not an accurate picture, but the Democrats could go a long way towards rectifying that if they would do something like get rid of ICE, as an example. And there's a call for that, but they have this older demographic within the party that feels unsafe, and they want to be secure, and they like law enforcement. They like ICE, as an example. But a lot of those people that you're talking about that are working in these industries and the meatpacking facilities, they may be legal themselves, but they don't want to have a knock on the door to be questioned about their friends and relatives. So they stay on the down low, and I think that's got a lot to do with it. Even, maybe they have reasons not to want to answer questions, but they don't want to be questioned about their friends and relatives that are here in the country either. And I don't blame them for that. Well, here I'm looking at the clock. I try to keep these recorded opening segments of podcast by George to about half an hour, 45 minutes or so. So we're going to have to come back to this, but that's great because I want to keep going with this.
One comment, though, if I could. I think simply abolishing immigration controls, I'm not sure what abolishing ICE actually means. It means different things to different people.
Yeah.
I do not believe that you can run a real economy with unlimited immigration. And it's been a mistake of folks to think you can. You're going to have to find humane and sensible ones. I like the Canadian policies. in some of the European countries, but not all of them. I mean, a discussion of European immigration would take us way far afield. But my sense is that's another failing of the Democrats, is that they have not really explored these questions very well. And I think they're going to get themselves into big trouble in the near future on this.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm going to put the Chiron there across the bottom of the page so people can check out this paper, read it. I have. It's great. I guess the overriding message that I get out of this and that we get every day, Dr. Ferguson, for people that are awake and understanding what's happening in this country is we got to get the money out of it. We got to get the money out of politics. If we don't, this isn't going to get better anytime soon, and there's reason to believe it's going to get a lot worse.
No, I certainly agree. This is principally, first and foremost, a money-driven system. And yeah, if you can't check political money, you are going to have huge trouble. Now, one problem is that you've got a series of court decisions that sort of cements the position of corporations as people. Now, but you can do a lot. Look, even public funding of campaigns for people who don't want to go on the take, so that they have a possibility to run. I think a really important reform that does work. It changes, I think, even in states that have tried this on a limited basis. I think it's better off there at the local levels. But yeah, for sure, if you don't get money out of politics and above all, put limits on the ability of people to go into the government and then come out and resell their knowledge. I mean, it's crazy when, for example, both Republicans and Democrats do this, but all the senior foreign policy people in the Biden administration, they were sitting together in one little firm that claimed to be able to tell clients what was going to happen and things. Then they all went into the administration. When they come back out, you're going to go straight back into that. Randy Quarles left the Fed. He was a Republican appointee. And he went straight back into his old firm. I mean, you've got to stop the revolving door, public funding, some limits. You got to get them all out of the stock market. They should not be allowed to sort of make laws. I mean, now there's some laws on the books right now, but when you get Pelosi saying as she did,
oh my God, yeah.
I mean, it's just like, come on, guys, this is not ancient Rome, where we are a small aristocracy that will just loot the place, or it's not supposed to be. No, you got a serious money in politics, bro.
Yeah, and the thing about Pelosi, they're talking about single stocks, individual stocks. I mean, that would be a great starting point. It's not that those folks can't have investments. They can't have a portfolio. They can't have a mutual fund, but you can't have the ability to make fortunes on a single vote that affects a single stock.
That's right. No, what some of those Fed folks did who, are charged, because I haven't seen where they were changing their portfolio the day before votes and things like that. I mean, come on. Yeah. I mean, anybody can see that this is wrong. I mean, really.
That's absolutely. Well, like I mentioned, I want to circle back. I'm going to put this web address up so that people now go read this paper, folks. It's a great read. We'll come back to this and we'll get some more questions in, and maybe we'll do this one live where we can take questions from the viewers. And I want to thank him for coming on, particularly on short notice. It's Dr. Thomas Ferguson. Doctor, I'm going to give you the opportunity here to wrap up, kind of put a bow on this for us because we're getting out of here. Give us a close.
Well, I fear that if we don't do something, you'll look back on the current situation as a golden age.
Oh my God!
Really a problem. It's not my usual ending on these for a long time has been, if you want a happy ending, see a Disney movie. But look, this is getting altogether too dark and scary. I mean, people we have serious problems with corporate money in both major parties.
That's well said. I mean, that's great. And like I tell people, it's human nature, really is, to think that things are going to get better. But folks, this ain't natural. I mean, that's the way that we'll leave it. And we've got Dr. Thomas Ferguson. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's the director of research at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and a senior fellow at Better Markets. Dr. Ferguson, thanks again for coming on Podcast by George.
I'm glad to do it. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah, folks, we'll come back to him. And if you like Podcast by George, my closing is always go to podcastbygeorge.com and pick a platform there, a little badge and icon where you would like to be notified when each new episode, including those with Thomas Ferguson, I hope, coming up on the PBG. It's easy to do. It's all free. Just go to podcastbygeorge.com. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.